Hi, welcome back. I'm Cheryl Strachan, and this is video number 2 on how to eat well for life after a heart event. Today, I'm going to focus on 10 pitfalls I'm going to help you avoid so that you can stay on track. But first, a quick recap of what I covered in video number 1, the 6 keys to eating well for life after a heart event. First of all, you are the boss, you know yourself best, and you get to decide how big a priority this is and which direction you're going to go. Number 2, in general, think Mediterranean, so more fruits and vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts and seeds, fish, olive oil, and cooked by you, ideally. Less takeout and less food out of boxes, although there's lots of minimally processed convenience foods that we can use to help make that cooking a little bit easier. Number 4, have a plan and keep it simple. Number 5, remember to eat. Eat every few hours throughout the day so you don't get too hungry, and resist the urge to try restricting your calories too much. It doesn't usually work in the long run. And finally, enjoy your food. Get satisfaction out of it, and you may find it quite easy to eat this way for the rest of your life. Okay, let's jump into today's topic. So I've been a dietitian now for about 15 years, so I had some fun brainstorming this. I've worked with hundreds, if not thousands of people who are adjusting to life after having had a heart event. And these are some of the things that I see again and again that get people into trouble. I'll give you a quick overview of them, and then we'll dive into each one, and I'll help you with what to do instead. So first challenge is when people are focused on goals that involve avoiding something, like not having another heart attack. That doesn't tend to work as well in the long run. Similarly, in terms of our eating habits, there tends to be a focus on what you can't or shouldn't have, which I'm using those words in quotes because I don't believe there's actually anything you can't or shouldn't have. But the foods you think are off limits now, dessert, bacon, pizza, you name it, that seems to occupy people's mental energy. Number 3, working without a solid foundation. And I call this the 4 S's: stress, sleep, your schedule, and support. And when you don't have those in place, it can be much harder to eat in a way that supports good heart health. Number 4, what I call headline headaches. You know the headlines I'm talking about, right? Eggs are good today, not so good tomorrow, and it drives everyone nuts, right? What I call fake whole grains. You've heard that whole grains are good, but actually figuring out which foods in the grocery store are whole grains can be tricky. Number 6, still not enough fruit and vegetables. I think everybody comes to me kind of knowing that fruit and vegetables are a really important component of heart healthier eating, but it is tough to get an optimal amount. So we can still work on that, and I'll give you some tips. Number 7, we still have this residual fear of fat, especially if you learned about nutrition in the 1990s when that was a real dominant theme. That still kind of lingers for people. Number 8, measuring success in pounds, deciding whether or not your approach to heart healthy eating is working based on how much weight you've lost, gets people into trouble. Number 9, perfection, enemy of the good, right? And finally, wishing for willpower, or coming to me and telling me, I just don't have willpower, Cheryl. You don't need willpower, and I'll talk to you about what you can do instead. Okay. Let's jump in. Let's start by talking about goals. And my objective here is to make sure that you're focused on goals that will help you move in the right direction and stay moving there. So if you're already making changes to your eating habits, adding certain things or maybe cutting things out, I invite you to pause for a moment and consider what's driving that change for you. What's motivating you to do that? If you have the time, even stop the video and write those down on a pad of paper. So were the answers you came up with more about avoiding something or moving towards something? And if you said you're working on something like not having another heart attack or not having a stroke if your blood pressure is high, or God forbid, dying, not dying, if those things are what's motivating you to change, and that's very understandable after what you've been through at this point, you may unfortunately find you don't have as much success with that, especially not in the long run. So I first learned about this from health psychologist Michael Vallis, who I've seen speak a few times. And he always talks about how motivation from negative factors typically only lasts about 3 to 6 months. And I've seen that in my professional experience. People come in highly motivated to make drastic changes to their diet if they're fearful after having a heart event, which, like I said, is understandable. But here's the good news. That fear doesn't typically last. After 6 months or a year, certainly 5, 10 years down the line, we don't see people constantly living in the fear of having another event. And I've worked with Calgary's local cardiac support group as a volunteer for a few years. And so I've had a wonderful experience meeting people who've lived more than 20 years past their cardiac event. And you'll be glad to hear they don't think about it every day all the time. But when that fear fades, if that's what was motivating you to make changes, then what's going to keep you going? The key is to find personally meaningful reasons to act that will still be relevant to you for years to come. So the terminology I'm going to use here around the goals, I first learned about on the blog Heart Sisters. So I like to give credit where credit is due and also recommend excellent resources. And this is definitely one. If you're not already following this blog, I highly recommend it. It is for women living with heart disease, but I think much of what's written in there would also be relevant and helpful to men. The author, Carolyn Thomas, had a heart attack in 2008. And she has quite a story. She was initially sent home from the hospital, even shamed by a nurse for coming in with her symptoms and bothering the doctor. And she persevered and went back, and it turned out she was having a heart attack. Thank goodness she did that. She's written a blog with all sorts of tips and stories about people and their experiences with heart disease, which she then turned into this book, A Woman's Guide to Living with Heart Disease. So definitely recommend her. And like I say, I learned this terminology from here. I'll give you a couple of good examples of how to shift your thinking around your goals. So let's say you're looking at this beautiful pasta and you say to yourself, I'll just have one serving because I don't want to get diabetes. So that's an example of an avoidance goal. You may find it works better in the long run to say something like, I'll just have one serving because I want to have more energy after supper. And I specifically chose that example because not only is it something you're working towards or an approach goal, but it's relevant in the here and now, not in the long run, which may feel less compelling. Another example, we're eating more fish these days because I don't want to have another heart attack. Okay, that's fine, but you may again find it works better if you say, we're eating more fish because I really want to continue enjoying my grandchildren. Something positive that you're working towards, an approach goal, in other words, you may find works more effectively. So the next pitfall is similar in that I find people often focus on the foods they think they can't have or that they should eat less of. So pause for a moment, and again, if you have time, stop the video and actually write this down. What does heart-healthy food mean to you? So if some of the first things that popped into your mind look like this, no sugar, no carbs, no fat, no salt, no bacon, or maybe less of those things, which isn't quite as harsh, then you're not alone, right? This is very common and understandable after having an event. And when you're in that fear space, of course, you want to just do everything you can to reduce your risk. But where we end up is like this little doggy here, no joy. And it's hard to stay excited about that in the long run. So I would encourage you instead to focus on the literal feast of cardioprotective foods that can help fill your plate, achieve your heart health goals, and leave you feeling satisfied. In that spirit, I'd like to just take a moment to talk about the word diet. And I try not to use it, but I know it slips in now and again. There are two definitions, and the first one here is quite neutral, the kinds of food that a person, animal, or community habitually eats. Unfortunately, in our culture, this word has taken on a really negative connotation, and that's related to this second definition, a special course of food to which a person restricts themselves, either to lose weight or for medical reasons, as in I'm going on a diet, which kind of implies that at some point you're going off the diet. So again, I don't want to think in these terms, so I try to use the phrase way of eating or eating pattern, and what I'm looking for is to get at that first definition. We're just going to talk neutrally about the food that you eat and not think of it as something you have to do or that's restrictive or that's for the purposes of depriving yourself. So let's reframe the way we think about our food. And again, this is kind of related to the approach goals. Instead of saying, I can't have red meat anymore, and of course, don't say that because just like in the 6 keys in video number 1, you don't want to give up your power, but I hear people saying that. I mean, at least say, I've decided not to have red meat anymore. Okay. Maybe though, instead, even go one step further and frame it in a positive light and say, we're trying a new fish recipe every week. We're getting really excited about fish. We kind of like it, actually. Do you see how much more excited and motivated you can get to keep doing that? So let's frame it up that way. So the next challenge people often have is trying to make significant changes to their eating habits without a solid foundation. With the way we live these days, and especially this year, I would ask yourself, am I set up for success with this? And I'll tell you a story. This was many years ago. A woman came to me after having a heart attack, and her doctor had recommended that she needed to lose quite a bit of weight. And so, as I always do, I ask about these four foundational pieces. I call them the 4 S's: stress, sleep, support, and schedule. And through the course of that conversation, revealed to me that her husband was about to go into chemotherapy for cancer. And I just stopped and said, is this a good time for you, do you think, to take on this weight loss goal? And she kind of looked at me and lit up and said, no, thank you for saying that. You're the first person that's acknowledged that that's going to make it harder. So consider the role these 4 foundational pieces might have in your journey towards healthier eating. Sleep, for example, in clinical studies, when volunteers are intentionally deprived of sleep, they eat hundreds of additional calories the next day, which is just natural. It's driven by hormonal changes in the body. Chronic stress. Similarly, hormonal changes drive people to seek more food, particularly fat and sugar-laden foods, which seem to have a feedback effect that dampens the stress-related responses to emotions. So if you find yourself eating more when you're under stress, that's not just you. That's biology. It's natural. How about support? Are your friends and family cheering you on and helping you? Are they sitting next to you watching this video? If you feel more like you're alone, then maybe that's something we should figure out how to address. And finally, with your schedule, do you have time to plan, prepare, and eat healthy food? So if you said no to any of these things, what I would encourage you to do, first of all, is maybe ask for help. Either go to your doctor or maybe reach out to someone in your community or your circle. And the other thing is, with respect to healthy eating and food, it's not that we're going to put it off or use this as an excuse to not do it, but I would say the focus would be more on nourishing you and energizing you through whatever challenges you're facing, as well as having self-compassion for when, you do eat a little bit more because you didn't sleep well and you're under a lot of stress. That's natural. So beating yourself up over it's not going to do you any good. And you can still work with somebody, a dietitian or somebody else, to make some heart health related changes to your diet, but maybe you'll be a bit more flexible on those while you're focusing on getting help with these foundational pieces. The next pitfall I want to help you avoid is what I call headline headaches. I went out and grabbed a couple of examples here, and it wasn't hard, and these are from the same media outlet. So first of all, about eggs, which is a topic that drives everybody nuts, and I am going to tackle that in video number 3 when we talk about FAQs. But for now, let's just look at these headlines. An egg a day may reduce heart disease risk. Less than a year later, same news outlet. Eggs are linked to a higher risk of heart disease and early death. Or how about wine? Again, same news outlet, less than a year apart. Even moderate drinking might be bad for aging brains. Oh no. And then we have your daily glass of wine could improve brain health. Nice. But seriously, it can be discouraging, I know. Trust me, clinicians like myself even get really frustrated with these controversies. So I just want to remind you, what is the one job of a headline? I know you know this. Headlines are there for one reason, just to get you to read, to click, or to open up a newspaper, and the more controversial, the better. The problem is that this sometimes leads people to throw up their hands and give up, and that's counterproductive. So it might help to consider why nutrition, and cardiac nutrition in particular, is so rife with controversies. Heart disease, first of all, remember, is complex, developing over many years with many contributing factors. And diet is complex too, right? Think of how many different foods you've eaten over the course of your life and multiply that by all the people out there and all the different cultures. Try to figure out, untangle the various causes can be pretty tricky. So scientists try to study that. They have a couple of options. Number one, they can do short-term studies that look at the effect of diet on risk factors like cholesterol and blood pressure and blood sugars, BG, blood glucose there. And those kinds of things change pretty quickly. So those studies aren't that hard to do. They can be done in 6 months and we can see what happened to risk factors. But we have to make a bit of a leap of faith to assume that Something that affected a risk factor will go on to affect what we really care about, which is cardiac outcomes. In other words, how many heart attacks were there? How many people had to go to the hospital? How many people had symptoms that made them worry and stay up at night? How many people died? How many people stayed alive longer in your study? And unfortunately, those things take a lot longer to develop, so they're harder to study. Sometimes I like to think of all the different nutrition research out there as kind of a puzzle with the higher quality evidence at the top, the randomized controlled trials, but we know we don't have as many of those, especially not the long-term ones that look at outcomes. So then we have other kinds of research as part of the puzzle, and you would never figure out a whole puzzle just based on looking at one piece. And similarly, one study and the headlines that get all excited about it should never be what drives your eating decisions. So experts who study this stuff will look at all the different pieces of the puzzle and put them together and come up with either clinical practice guidelines or consensus statements. And this is one that I really like to go back to. This is Old Ways. I introduced them in video number 1. And in 2015, Old Ways convened a summit of nutrition experts from various disciplines: vegan, plant-based, paleo, Mediterranean, as well as some of our leading nutrition researchers, and kind of locked them in a room and said, you guys can't leave until you come up with a statement of the things that you agree on, because there was this shared concern that the media portrays nutrition as being all about controversy, when in fact they agree on much more than they disagree on. So this is the statement that they came up with, and you can see echoes of the same things that I've been talking about here. So despite the fact that nutrition science is so messy, I would say focus on these things that we have really good, consistent evidence with, the pieces of the puzzle kind of all pointing in the same direction. And for those controversial things like eggs or wine or coconut oil or red meat, factor in your experience, your preferences, your values, and keep moderation in mind. So if eggs are something that really help you in the morning, you like them, they give you a good foundation for the day, then include them. But you might not want to go with 6 eggs every morning, right? Moderation still. Red wine, same thing. Red meat. If you really like red meat, you're committed to supporting the beef industry, then maybe you still have that in your diet, but you're not having a steak every night for dinner, right? Moderation and factoring in your own preferences can really take you a long ways towards eliminating those headline headaches. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about food. Number 5 is what I like to call fake whole grains. And this is one of my favorite topics because I don't like you to get fooled. So you probably know that whole grains are beneficial for heart health. But if I asked you which grains you regularly eat, what would you say? Probably oats, maybe bread and some kind of bread products. And when I ask this question in class, if I probe further, we'll sometimes hear things like brown rice or quinoa, but the list is usually kind of short and almost always includes bread. So let's make sure that your bread is a real whole grain. So quick refresher, what is a whole grain? Imagine that this is a kernel of wheat, and there are 3 components. The endosperm is what they use to make white flour and white bread and other products. Has some nutrition, some starch, protein, some vitamins and minerals, but most of the nutrition is found in the bran and the germ. When you think of wheat bran, what comes to mind? Fiber, right? And fiber isn't just good for regularity, it's good for heart health. And the germ is the heart of the kernel, providing much of the nutrition, including things that are important for heart health, like minerals. You see it says minerals there. They're talking about things like magnesium, which plays a role in blood sugar metabolism, and potassium, which helps with blood pressure management. So if you cook and eat this whole thing intact, you're good to go. Definitely a whole grain. With wheat, that means eating wheat berries or farro, for example. Some other grains are more commonly eaten whole and intact. Brown rice, quinoa, barley, even oats, which are just typically steamed and rolled. With flour, on the other hand, the kernel is ground up into tiny particles. If they use them all, it's whole grain flour. But more commonly, the flour is separated into components and products are usually made with just the endosperm, leaving the bran and germ out. But how would you know? If you go to the grocery store, you look at the fronts of these packages, can you tell which one is a whole grain? See if you can guess. Believe it or not one of these is a whole grain. The only way to know for sure is by looking at the list of ingredients. And they're listed in order by weight, so it's really that first one that we're more interested in. There'll be more of that in the package than anything else. And in this case, it says enriched wheat flour. Often people see enriched, sounds good, wheat, yeah, that's what we're looking for, right? No, if it doesn't say whole, it's not a whole grain. This one is simply white flour. That's just the endosperm of the wheat kernel we were looking at. By law, they have to add several nutrients like iron and folic acid to help prevent deficiencies, but this still falls far short of the nutrition found in the whole grain. Now, I have to say this bread is more nutritious than just straight white bread. The other grains and seeds in there, you see like oats and sunflower seeds, they do add some nutrition. But given that they're the third and fourth ingredients on the list, after the white flour and the water, it's not likely to be much. So instead, what you want to look for is products where the first ingredient includes the word whole, if it's a wheat-based product. Sprouted grains are actually always whole and more nutritious, so if you like them, even better. Here's another example these are crackers made with whole grain rye flour. Now, rye is always a whole grain. It doesn't actually have to say whole grain rye flour, but I think they just want to make sure that you know it's a whole grain. And on the right there, you see other examples of whole grains. So when you see something like quinoa or brown rice in an ingredient list, it doesn't really have to say whole quinoa or whole brown rice because they're always used whole. But when it comes to wheat, if it doesn't say whole something, then it isn't. So now that you know how to spot a fake whole grain, take a look in your pantry. If you have time, stop the video and see if you can find some bread, crackers, buns, tortillas, or other wheat products that aren't whole, but kind of look healthy and might fool someone. Okay, we're on a roll, up to pitfall number 6 here. Still not enough fruit and vegetables. Usually people who come to see me are pretty motivated, so they're eating fruit and vegetables, but getting that half plate worth, that's a stretch, right? For all of us. And when you look at the food, say on this picture, are the fruit and vegetables half the plates? Not even by a long shot. What's half the plate? In most of these pictures, it's grain products, right? And they don't even look like they're whole grains, maybe with the exception of the cereal. The point is, most people still have a ways to go from the typical Western diet to a more fruit and vegetable-based one, but we can do this, right? So few creative ideas with fruit. Most people just eat it plain as a snack or maybe with their breakfast or as a dessert, which is great. But if you want to get a little bit more in your day, maybe think about pairing it with something really satisfying like cheese or nuts so it makes a more longer lasting snack, or chop it up and add to salads or stir fries. You know, people don't usually think of this, but a little pineapple or mango in a stir fry is a really fresh addition. Or cook them. Baked or even microwave sliced apples are a real comfort food, and when they cool off, they travel quite well as a snack. You can bake pears or even make a fruit crisp. This counts too, right? Go easy on the topping, heavy on the fruit, and you've got an everyday food that can make it kind of fun to get more fruit in your diet. How about vegetables? Well, first of all, let's make them more interesting. I wrote a blog post not long ago about ways to get vegetables in your life, and I ended up getting 70 different ideas. Sometimes you just have to spend a little time thinking about it, brainstorming, right? And I know you know this, but you have so much on your mind right now, so I'm going to give you just a few reminders. First of all, get some flavor in the mix. And when I say that, I think most people think herbs and spices, which are fantastic, absolutely. You can also drizzle vinaigrette on cooked vegetables. You can dip things in hummus or even ranch dressing. And you might be shocked to hear me say that, but read the label. It's mostly healthy fat. There's not a lot of sugar in them. There might be some sodium. So read the labels. If you are buying a bottled one, buy one that's lower in sodium or make it yourself, even better. And then just go easy on it. But if it means that you eat more vegetables, I think it's worth it. Same with a little butter, a little salt or soy sauce. If it gets you eating more vegetables, it may be worth the trade-off, especially if overall in your diet, there's not a lot of those things. Or use your vegetables for flavor. You cook with garlic and ginger, right? Those are technically vegetables. Or add things like sun-dried tomatoes or cooked mushrooms or canned artichokes to a dish. And again, someone's going to say, I know there's more sodium in canned artichokes. Yes, but if the rest of the dish is low in sodium and you're using it in moderation, it's a good trade-off. Can we all agree? No boring salads. Use more than just vegetables in your salads. Think different greens. Think about adding cooked grains like farro or barley to make them more filling, more satisfying. Add chopped nuts or seeds, vinaigrettes. Make your own at home. You can get so much great flavor in a vinaigrette. Or use meat as a condiment. This is kind of the Mediterranean way of using meat, not as the center of the plate, but instead smaller amounts kind of chopped up and added to a meal with lots of vegetables. Or add your vegetables to whatever you're making. Lasagna, eggs, soup, sandwiches, pasta, burritos, chili, you know it. The list goes on, right? And take advantage of time savers. There are lots of things in our grocery stores. Pre-washed spinach and other leafy greens, pre-cut raw vegetables. They might cost more, but if it means more of that food ends up in you instead of the green bin, then you'll save money in the long run, right? And if you need something less expensive, there are more frozen vegetables in the market than we've ever had. And there are lots of creative ways you can use them. There's another blog post on my website. Just search it up and you'll find it, or shoot me an email and I'll send it to you. The final trick is just to put out raw vegetables like cherry tomatoes and snap peas and carrots when you're cooking dinner and when everybody in the house is kind of hungry and impatiently waiting for dinner, and they'll disappear. No one says that half plate of vegetables has to be literally on the plate, right? The idea is just that about half your eating in a day is made up of fruit and vegetables. And I know that's a stretch for all of us, so let's keep working at it. Okay, on to number 7, fear of fat. So I used muffins for this slide because I find people still tell me that they're having low-fat muffins or low-fat peanut butter. The trouble is, with some low-fat foods, manufacturers add more sugar or more sodium to compensate for that lack of fat, or people eat more of them because they're low in fat, like frozen yogurt. So we're actually going in the wrong direction here. Take this peanut butter, for example. Now, peanut butter is a high-fat food, right? So no one would blame you for going for the light one. But as with the bread, get out your reading glasses and take a good look at the list of ingredients. With the light peanut butter, the first ingredient is still peanuts, but then there's corn maltodextrin, which is kind of like a highly processed cornstarch, adding carbohydrates but no other nutrition. And then sugar for even more empty calories. The funny thing is, when we look at the nutrition facts, they have almost the same amount of calories because basically we've traded a little bit of heart-healthy fat for those extra carbohydrates. Turns out that puts you at more risk for cardiovascular disease. Let me just repeat that. Trading in fat for extra carbohydrates actually raises your risk for cardiovascular disease. And that's why this is one of my pet peeves, because when someone's had a heart event and they're trying their darndest to eat healthier, we don't need them being misled into doing something that takes them in the wrong direction. So, okay, I hear you say, I get it. There are some healthy fats, but not too much, right? Should you count out your 14 almonds or measure your salad dressing or limit your peanut butter to a thin layer? No. I mean, anything can be taken to the extreme, and I'm not suggesting that, but most people can and maybe should be having more fat than I typically see in food records. Would you believe me if I told you in the Mediterranean arm of the PREDIMED study, which I talked about in video number 1, they actually recommended participants have at least 4 tablespoons a day of olive oil. Some of the participants were even provided with an ounce a day of nuts, but despite that, the group in the Mediterranean arm didn't gain weight over the course of that study. So you don't have to eat that much, but the take-home message here is that eating more foods rich in heart-healthy fat, like fish and nuts and seeds and olive oil, makes sense, especially if you're cutting back on other food to compensate. So what that looks like is maybe you nibble more on nuts, but you eat fewer crackers and pretzels. Maybe you have more avocado on one piece of toast, whole grain, right? Instead of just a little in a sandwich with 2 pieces of bread. And hopefully that makes eating more satisfying too. Okay, next. Here's a story I've heard countless times. A person goes through 12 weeks of cardiac rehab, and at their 12-week follow-up appointment, they get weighed. Their weight loss isn't as much as they'd hoped, or maybe not as much as they'd been told to achieve. And someone says, why don't you go see the dietitian? And when I talk to them, the story from the patient is, cardiac rehab didn't work for me. Or even worse, I failed at cardiac rehab. And when we dig into their chart, we inevitably discover many ways in which the person has very much not failed. First of all, completing the program alone is a win. That's predicted to result in a 21 to 34% lower risk of dying in the next 5 years, according to a 2009 study in the United States. Cardiac rehab also results in fewer hospital admissions, which I know means a lot to people, and increases in overall quality of life. And beyond just completing the program, we might find that their exercise tolerance or cholesterol levels or other risk factors have improved, all associated with improved long-term outcomes. They might be eating more vegetables and less fast food, but the most visible thing to people and the easiest for them to measure themselves is weight. So they feel like they failed. So the bad news, good news is that cardiac rehab delivers benefits despite typically not producing significant weight loss. Would the benefit be greater if people also lost weight? We can't really say because we don't have a study where people have lost weight after a heart event and kept it off long enough to show that. Now, I know the cardiac world is quite weight loss focused, so you might be advised to lose weight. And there are some cardiovascular benefits, at least in the short run. But here's the thing. We don't yet have a diet or exercise regime that reliably produces significant long-term weight loss. Surgery is an option that benefits some people, but it's not without risks, of course. There are some medications that might help. We may be able to slow down or prevent weight gain that is typical in our culture as people age, but the reality is that most people who lose weight gain it back between 2 and 5 years, potentially harming their commitment to proven health behaviors, not to mention their self-esteem. And I don't want to set you up for that failure down the line. So I prefer to focus instead on benefits that are supported by the evidence, like attending cardiac rehab, like eating the Mediterranean way. So both of the studies I've already introduced you to, participants' weight stayed largely the same. Yet the ones in the Mediterranean groups lived longer, healthier lives. In another landmark diet study, looking at blood pressure, so this is not an outcome study, but again, we saw results without weight loss. So researchers provided the food to participants and carefully controlled the amount they got so they could see how it impacted blood pressure without the effect of weight loss. And by the way, the DASH way of eating is similar to Mediterranean, but without the emphasis on olive oil, fish, and red wine. So it's rich in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, and easy on the meat. And it lowers blood pressure and cholesterol, incidentally, without weight loss. On the other hand, one of the biggest, most ambitious studies that attempted to show improved cardiac outcomes with weight loss was actually stopped early because benefits for cardiovascular morbidity and mortality weren't seen. So focus on what you do, not what you weigh. You might lose weight and you might not, but you can still reduce your risk by eating well and, of course, staying active. So instead of stepping on the scale to decide if you're making progress, try measuring some of these things instead. And I know they're not as easy to measure as weight. Some of them are subjective, but try keeping track of them. And if they improve, even if your weight doesn't change, you are still succeeding. Okay, so 2 more quick ones. Pitfall number 9 is trying for, quote, perfect eating. And after a heart attack, that's understandable. You might want to do everything in your power to avoid having another one. But my concerns are, number 1, that may not be sustainable, and then you won't have learned what moderation looks like. And number 2, we don't have evidence that it's necessary. Remember, risk factors for heart disease go well beyond just food. The things that you can control include your activity levels, taking your medication, following up with your appointments with your physician and others. So don't put too much pressure on your eating. And number 3, and this is kind of related, trying to follow, quote, a perfect diet might add to your stress, and that's actually counterproductive. So what does this perfection mindset look like for people who've had a heart event? If you hear yourself saying never or no salt, no sugar, never have carbohydrates, or if something feels like a forbidden food, red meat, can't have it, eating out, not going to do it. If you think of food as good or bad, kale is good, brownies are bad, or worse, by extension, I hear people say that they've been good or bad based on what they eat. You know, over the weekend I was really bad. I had brownies. No, you weren't bad. Let's keep it in perspective, right? If you think of yourself as being, quote, on a diet, or if you're trying to actually follow a strict diet plan, a couple of the popular ones with people who are living with heart disease are the keto diet or strict low-fat vegan diet. And I'll talk about both of those in video number 3. But any of those are signs that you're falling into this perfection pitfall. Sometimes we call it all or nothing thinking. And the downside is it can lead to cravings and resentment, saying things like, not fair, it's Dad's birthday and I can't even have any cake because of this thing. Eventually that may derail you. So instead, here are some practical ways to get out of that perfection mindset. First of all, ask yourself, realistically, how sustainable is this for me? Do I want to live this way for the rest of my life? I'm still going to have birthdays and holidays and vacation. Things are still going to go sideways in life. What'll I do then? What'll I do when there's a global pandemic and I'm stuck at home? How will I be able to adapt this style of eating for my real life? And can I find a happy medium there? Maybe you've heard of the 80-20 principle, which is that 80% of the time you're picking food primarily because it supports your health, and 20% of the time it's more for pleasure or some other reason. But don't think of that as 80% of the time you're eating, quote, perfectly healthy, and 20% of the time you're having what some people call a cheat meal or a cheat day. No, I like to think of it as most of the time you're most of the way there on each of those 3 criteria in my sweet spot diagram. So maybe you're eating broccoli, but you add a little butter to it. Maybe you are adding some brown sugar to your oatmeal. I like to call it healthy-ish. It's about finding the right balance for you. That's where it helps to have a little nutrition know-how. Say with sodium. If I had $1 for everyone who told me we've banned the salt shaker at our house and they're going to Subway for lunch and they're having sausages with spaghetti sauce from a jar for dinner, they're missing the big picture there. And that's really just a nutrition education thing. And we can solve that, no problem. Understanding a little bit about nutrition, I always say, can help you not only eat healthier, of course, but enjoy your food more. So let's not make things harder for you than they have to be. You don't have to be perfect on this one. Number 10, wishing that you had more willpower. I hear this often. Cheryl, I just don't have any willpower. And if you feel that way, you're definitely not alone. And it's not that anything is wrong with you. Hunger is a primal need. We have a biological drive not to starve to death. And so if you don't feed yourself adequately and if food is all around you, it is our very natural instinct to eat, especially foods that are rich in energy. So don't beat yourself up if you feel like you don't have enough willpower. So this idea was popularized by a 2012 TED Talk by health behavior researcher Al Switzer, who said, instead of willpower, let's look for skill power. Number 1, going back to that solid foundation, the 4 S's, sleep, stress, your schedule, and your support. Make sure those things are in line. Food skills. Do you know how to read labels, prepare food, plan your food? Can we make it a routine or a habit so that you don't have to give a lot of thought to it? Because I know you have lots of other things going on. So, thinking of breakfast, can you have just 1 or 2 breakfasts and alternate them or however you like so that you've just got that routine? You get up in the morning, you don't have to think a lot about it, and you get your good breakfast in and start the day. Can you set up your food environment so it supports what you want to do? Don't have potato chips on the counter so that if you decide to have potato chips, you are intentionally doing that. And there are other things we can do to set up your home and office so that the easy choice is the healthy choice. So there you have it, 10 pitfalls to avoid. Number 1, think about goals that bring you to something, having more energy or having better blood sugar control, rather than working on something you want to avoid. Similarly, focus on the foods you're adding, those cardioprotective foods, fruits and vegetables, and so much more, instead of the things you feel like you can't have. Make sure the foundation is solid, and certainly don't let the headlines make you throw in the towel on the whole thing. Most of what we know about food and health, most experts agree on. That the controversies are minor, but they do occupy a lot of our attention. Make sure you've got real whole grains, things like oats and quinoa and farro and barley, as well as whole grain bread. Make sure you're getting enough fruits and vegetables. That is something we all have to focus on. Fat is okay, even saturated fat, and I'm going to talk about that in video number 3. Don't measure your success in pounds. If you are sleeping better, eating better, staying active, getting fruits and vegetables, all of those things matter whether your weight changes or not. Now, hopefully you're convinced you don't have to be perfect. There are no forbidden foods. And finally, you don't have to wait to have better willpower. So that's video number 2. And I hope you found it helpful. Send me some feedback or comment below. I'd love to hear what you have to say. And watch your email. In a few days, we'll come out with video number 3, which is the frequently asked questions. Until then, take care and happy eating.